Greetings folks, my name is Wrongways Gamgee and welcome to the D20 System Development Vlog. In this video, I want to talk about D20's systems for taking injuries and recovering from injuries. If you've watched my previous video on grit, you might ask yourself, didn't we cover this already? Not really. I did mention in that video that I would cover the toughness tests in the next video, which is this one, which is the game mechanic that is part of taking injuries. So, when an attacker makes an attack test against the target to hurt them, they roll a d20 plus their most relevant attribute die plus their most relevant class die plus any relevant bonus dice, if any. The target resists by rolling their most relevant attribute die plus their most relevant class or feature die plus any relevant miscellaneous dice as penalty dice to subtract from the attacker's attack test. If the net attack test total is higher than 10, the attacker inflicts 1 point of damage for every point their net attack total beats 10. So, like a net attack total of 16 would inflict 6 points of damage. Now, if the target has any grit, they can choose to buy off the damage at a 1-per-1 basis. However, if there's any damage remaining after the target spends grit, if they spent it at all, first they take a minus d4 injury affliction and have to make a toughness test. A toughness test is a d6 roll that buys off the amount of remaining damage by the number rolled, so from 1 to 6 points of damage. The goal here is to buy off all remaining damage. If there's at least 1 point of damage remaining after the first toughness test, then the injury die gets upgraded twice to a minus d8. So it'll go from minus d4, so it'll be minus d4, and then minus d6, minus d8. Their movement is halved, and the target needs to make another toughness test, the second one, which is, again, rolling the d6 to buy off the rest of the remaining damage. So if in the first toughness test, say, the target took 8 points of damage, or the 6 from before, and they rolled a 3 on their toughness, or on the toughness test, that's still not enough to buy it all. So their injury die worsens twice, their movement is halved, and now they have to make a second toughness test to hopefully buy off, well, to hopefully get like 3 or better, in order to eliminate all 3. So if there's still at least 1 point of damage remaining after the second toughness test, then the injury die gets upgraded twice again to minus d12. Their target's movement is slowed to a crawl, and the target must make a third toughness test, rolling a d6 to hopefully buy off all remaining damage. If there's still at least 1 point of damage remaining after the third toughness test, then the injury die gets upgraded twice, yet again. However, minus d12 is the highest injury affliction die that a character can have, and upgrading an injury die beyond minus d12 means that the target dies from their injury. So, this mechanic makes it so that a target can, if the target has insufficient grit, and they're super unlucky with their toughness test die rolls, they can die from a minimum of 4 points of damage by rolling 3 ones in a row. Or if they're super lucky, they can actually survive 18 points of damage by rolling all 6s, and they'll be hanging on a thread. So now, what if the target was previously injured and they were unable to buy off all their damage with grit? In that case, you'd upgrade the existing injury affliction twice. Meaning that if you happen to have like a minus d2 affliction, because you're like recovering from it, then it would upgrade twice. So it would go from d2 to d4, and then from d4 to d6. Or if they had a d6, and they took an injury, then it would go from d6 to d8 and d8 to d10. So the reason that injuries are rated as a negative die rating is because having an injury hampers anyone attempting an action test to overcome a challenge, that is, which is mechanically expressed as a penalty die rolled by the opposition or by the GM in case of character versus environment. And the penalty dice roll subtracts from the injured initiator's action test total. So if a character with a minus D8 injury affliction performs an action test using their D6 dexterity and D4 class die in what you call it, in like a physical like challenge of character versus environment, the initiator would roll a D20 plus a D6 plus a D4. Now say they get a 17 from that, from their action test total. Then the GM makes a determination of the overall difficulty of like this challenge, and they figure it'd be something that would challenge an amateur, so they would roll no penalty dice based on that. However, the GM would still roll the D8 penalty die based off of their injury, and say in this case they happen to roll a 7. So then you'd subtract 7 from the initiator's action total of 17, which would bring it down to 10. Now, since in character versus environment, you need to roll higher than a 15 to succeed, in this case, the initiator would fail their action and they would suffer whatever consequences would naturally occur. Now, say you've got this nasty D8 injury affliction and you want to get rid of it, but how? So this is where rest and recovery comes into play. First off, the patient must be in an environment that will allow for meaningful rest and recovery. Once that condition is fulfilled, for every 24 hours of rest and recovery, or R&R, the patient performs an action test, the D20 roll, and then they would add their endurance die and also a D4 bonus die to their D20 roll. Succeeding on this action test, which would be rolling higher than a 15, would contribute to their recovery threshold on a 1-per-1 basis. So if on a rest and recovery roll they managed to roll an 18, then they succeeded by 3, so they would contribute 3 points into the recovery threshold. If there's a trained physician helping them out, the physician can also contribute to this recovery threshold by an action test that adds either their intelligence or their senses die and their healer class die. Now, in order to do this, they need to have a minimum healer class die of D2, to show that they have like training in this. Now, once the recovery threshold reaches 10, the patient's injury die downgrades once, and the recovery threshold resets to 0. Now, in the case of, say, you have a recovery threshold currently at 8, and then you do your 24-hour R&R rest period, and you happen to succeed by 4, then it'll go 9, 10. You recover and you downgrade your injury die from, say, like the D8 to a D6, and then the remaining 2 would add to the new recovery threshold, so then it'll be at 2. And once the patient's injury affliction die is reduced to D0, then you've made a full recovery. Now, the base rest and recovery conditions assume 21st century first world standards. Anything less than that imposes a penalty die on the patient's rest and recovery and or the physician's treatment efforts, anywhere from like a -2 D2 penalty die all the way down to a -D12 penalty die for truly abysmal rest and recovery conditions. Like, this is as bad as it can get while being able to have meaningful rest and recovery. If at any point the patient's condition doesn't allow for any form of R&R, like shit is just too hectic and like it's too stressful to like get any recovery, then they would lose whatever progress they've made to the recovery threshold, resetting it down to 0. So that's why it's really important to maintain meaningful rest and recovery conditions. Now, in the case of someone with the power to heal others on the spot, their healing ability would allow the patient to instantly make a rest and recovery roll, contributing their success to their recovery threshold. Now again, remember, the recovery threshold must reach 10 in order to downgrade an injury die once, and that if the patient is subject to conditions that are not conducive to meaningful rest and recovery, then their rest and recovery, or rather their recovery threshold, would go down to 0. So don't just like pop a potion or throw a light healing spell and oh, they got like some points of recovery and then to battle, because it's not enough to meaningfully reduce their injury. And let me see. And also in the case of like healing powers or whatnot, in order to curb like spam healing, the first action roll that a healer would make, they just roll as normal, trying to roll higher than a 15. However, any subsequent healing efforts after that would cost a cumulative 1 grit. So the second one would cost 1 grit just to make the roll, and the third one would cost 2 grit to make that roll, and so on and so forth, because like it's taxing them. And that's about it regarding taking injuries and recovering from injuries. If you like or dislike anything you've seen in this video, please give it a like or a dislike and leave a comment. Subscribe if you want to support my channel, and if you really want to support my endeavors, head over to my Patreon and become an appreciated trooper. The link is in the description. Until then, folks, take care and play to find out what happens.